I know you'll be delighted that we are now working on Chris's block, and Chris's block is 3.5 inches. So let's change that size before we print them out, and you will need 16 of these to make a total of 4 blocks. We're going to prepare our foundation pieces like we did before by marking the directional arrows and also the colors that we're going to use. Now let me talk to you about how we're going to cut these out for templates. As we always do, we print out one template or one foundation piece, but we have it mirror imaged so that we can use this to cut our fabric with. Now I want to show you a few things as you cut these pieces out. Now we can just start right here and we can begin to cut along the stitching lines like we always do. So there's one piece. And let's come over here and trim this piece. Now, we can even trim this piece. But if you look at what we have left, if I try to trim down the next one, I'm going to cut part of this section off. So I have to start cutting from the other end so that I can avoid that. So you always want to make sure that when you put your ruler down to cut your piece out, that you're able to cut from the one end all the way through the other one without interfering or cutting through another section, and you'll be good to go. So we'll do that, and then we can do this piece. Whoop. It's hard to do this with the camera in front of me, but hang on. Let's do it this way. Okay, we'll be able to keep on going. And after we cut this piece, we have to shift again, because if I cut on this line, I'm going to come all the way through this section. So now I have to go to the other side and cut that piece. So just be cautious as you're cutting these out that you're not cutting through a neighboring segment. And after you're done, you'll have all your templates. And again, you're going to make sure that you have made allowances for adding 1/2 inch all the way around when you actually begin to cut this out of your fabric. And I want to show you another time saver for when you're cutting out your fabric. If you look at piece number 6 and piece number 8, if you put them back to back, like so, you will notice they are exactly the same. So this means instead of having to lay all your strips out right sides up, you can just fold them in half, either right sides together or wrong sides together, and cut as many as you would need to include both segments 6 and 8. So normally we would cut, in this case, we would need 16 of this piece and 16 of this piece. Instead, now we're going to cut 16 all the way across, and that will give you 16 pieces of each instead of having to cut them separate. I hope that makes sense. But let's look at 2 more. Segment 4 and segment 5, again, if you put them back to back, are identical. So again, we can put them down with our fabric, and let me just show you for an example. Let me get a piece of fabric out. This is particularly good if you're working with a fabric that, in this case, has a definite right and wrong sign. Before we're relaying all the fabric's right sides together, the fact that we can now cut a strip and just leave it folded wrong sides together so you have a right side on each end. You could lay your pattern piece down, and when you cut this piece, you're getting one of piece 6, and you're also getting one of piece 8 with the same cut. The same holds true for pieces 4 and 5. When you cut those out, when you cut one segment, you'll get one for piece 4 and one for piece 5 because they're reversed. It's just another time saver you might want to use. Since we were together last time working on a speedier way of piecing our blocks, we're going to continue on with that again while we work on block number 4, which is Chris's block. We're going to work on 4 segments at a time so that we'll have them all together to complete one full star block. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our foundation pieces and we're going to flip them upside down. We're doing this so that we remember that the first piece has to go on the back of this foundation piece. And that's just a good reminder. So we're using piece 1 and we're using piece 2. Now it's probably also a good thing to do to just keep these clothespins pinned as a reminder that the black is piece 1 and the gold, and that's in my case, is piece 2. Of course, your colors will probably vary, but it's a good reminder as to what goes where. So I'm going to start out with my piece 1, and you'll notice that I have on these particular ones some wonky piecing here. Because we're trimming so much away, it's really not going to be a factor in our overall design, so I'm just going to go ahead and work with this. So we're going to lay this down wrong sides together on our foundation piece, and I'm going to take the gold and we're going to lay it down, and again I'm referring to gold, but it's actually piece 2, whatever color you're using for piece 2, and I'm going to lay it down right sides together with my piece 1. I'm going to make sure it extends far into the seam allowance here and it goes into the area it needs to there. I'm also going to flip it over to make sure that I'm covering all of piece 1 and that I have approximately 1/4 of an inch overlap into section 2. Once I'm sure that that's the case, then I'm going to start stitching between section 1 and 2. And just to be sure, we're going to flip it over, make sure everything covers, and we're good to go. So we know that the next sections that we piece on there for the subsequent pieces 2, 3, and 4 that we're going to put together, it's all going to work the same. So I'm going to lay this down wrong sides together. I'm going to take section 2 and I'm going to put that right sides together with my section 1. I'm going to make sure I extend into the seam allowance. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to adjust this so that I extend into section 2 by approximately 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to put it down and I'm going to stitch. And I'm going to continue on with the next 2 pieces. We're ready to move on to our next step, which is the pressing. We have our 4 sections already pieced with section 1 and 2, and we're going to go ahead now and press the seam open, or I'm sorry, press the seam. We're not pressing it open. And we're going to do that front and back. Now that the pressing is done, we're now ready to move on to trimming. So we're going to start between 1 and 3. We're going to put our cardstock down, fold our foundation piece over, and trim. And if you remember, I said I had that kind of wonky piece with a big chunk out of it. I'm able to take that chunk right now and make it go away. So it really didn't matter. And now we're going to also trim between 1 and 6, or 2 and 6. While we're trimming, I want to show you that I made a whoops, and this is what I've done. There's my piece 1 and 2 together, but if I flip it over this way, you'll see when I had pressed open my 2 that piece 2 does not go down to the very tip. So I'm going to have a little problem in that I'm not covering all that section. So whenever you place these pieces together, you do want to make sure that you're extending into the seam, but you can see that I've really extended into the seam, and that's why I've come up short. So it's back to the unripper for me, or the unsewer, and I'll be back. Even the teacher makes mistakes. When you're laying piece 2 down on piece 1, make sure that you're at least touching the line that goes into section 7. It's because this is such a strange shape. If you don't do that, then you're not going to get complete coverage on section 2. So by doing that, we're going to just go ahead and pin this so you can see what I'm talking about. We're going to put some pins in from the stitching side, and when we flip this over like so, we want to make sure that we're covering all the way down to the tip of section 2. So that's pretty important. So if you make sure that your piece is lined up with this line, which is the end of piece 7 and also where piece 6 connects, if you get it on that line right here, then you should be good to go. So we're going to go ahead and flip this over, and we're going to restitch this so that we do it right this time. Okay, I'm going to go back over and I'm going to press this, and then we'll go back to the trimming that we started to do before. We're now ready for piece 3. We're going to put that right sides together. Again, we're going to make sure that piece 3 touches the line closest to piece 7, and that it also extends into the seam allowance. Remember how we talked about the widest part of your fabric should be opposite the widest part of your segment? So we've got that lined up, so we know that we're doing good. So let's go ahead and stitch this. Now don't get confused. On piece 3 we start clear down here. We don't start from this point. We don't start from here. And let me hold this up so you can see it again. We're going to start right here at the intersection of 3 and 6 and come up. We do not want to start at the intersection of 2 and 3 because then you're not stitching far enough. So you're going to start at the intersection of 6 and 3 to do this line of stitching. And we flip it over, we can see that we have covered the whole segment for piece 3, so that's good. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the other ones, and I'll be back. We're on to piece 4. I've placed that piece right sides together against the pieces on my foundation piece. I've got everything lined up along the raw edges. I'm making sure that I'm more than enough into segment 7, and I'm also through the seam allowance on this end. So we're going to flip this over and we're going to stitch. Now on this you're going to stitch starting right here in the valley between 3 and 4 and come on through. Unlike the last one where we went down in further, this one we're stitching like we normally would between 3 and 4. And when we're done stitching, we'll flip that over. We'll flip it this way. Make sure that we've covered all of section 4. And we're ready for the next piece. So I'm going to go ahead and add these pieces, and I'll get back to you as soon as that's done. Now if you remember when we were doing the Bethettes, there was one part where we actually stitched 2 pieces on opposite sides before we went to pressing. We're going to do the same thing with this block. We're going to go ahead and fold this piece over and put a pin in it just to get it out of the way so that we don't accidentally stitch it into the next line of stitching. And then we're going to go ahead and put on piece 5, which is on this side. So we're going to take piece 5, put it right sides together. We want to make sure that we're in our seam allowance here and that we've extended into the adjoining section on the opposite side. We're going to flip this over and we're going to stitch between 2 and 5. And if we flip this over, you can see that we have indeed covered off piece 5. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch on the remaining piece 5s in these 4 segments, and I'll get back to you. We're now ready for piece 6 already. So let's go ahead and get that ready. We're going to place that with right sides together. We're going to make sure that we're extending into our seam allowance, but we also want to make sure that we're more than extending into the next segment. So we can actually move this down a little bit. We can flip this over and we're ready to stitch section 6. And here we go. And if we flip this over, you can see that we have totally covered section 6 all the way up to the point and all the way through the point on the opposite end. So I'll continue to stitch these and I'll come back to you as soon as these are finished. Just like we did for the last 2 blocks, I've gone ahead and pinned piece 6 in place to the foundation piece so that I can go ahead and add piece 7 so we can press both of those at the same time and continue stitching right now. So I've got pieces, my 7 pieces here. I'm going to count out 4 of them since we have 4 segments. Put this aside, and now we're getting ready to stitch piece 7. So I'm going to, if you look at piece 7, it's wider at the bottom than it is at the top. So we want the widest part on the bottom. We also want to make sure that we're going all the way into the seam allowance on the bottom as well as the top. So this piece should be basically centered between the top and bottom. So let's go ahead and stitch this. So now we have piece 7 on. I'll continue on with that, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Just like when we were dealing with the buffets, there are some critical matching points on this block as well. We have this section right here and this section right here that are going to be our match-up points when we're putting these 4 segments together to make one star block. So we're going to do the same thing that we did before, in that we're going to take section 9 and we're going to extend the line into the seam allowance so that we stitch all the way through, and we're sure that we're guaranteeing that we're going to match up. And we're going to do the same thing over here for section 8, all the way through the seam allowance there, and all the way through the seam allowance there. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these blocks, and then we'll come back and stitch. We're now ready for our last 2 pieces on this block, and that's piece 8 and 9. So I've pulled 4 of each out to put in our 4 sections. So I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to put on piece 8. And again, I'm going to make sure that I've extended into the seam allowance, both on this side and this side. I'm going to flip this over, and remember we've got these extended lines. We're going to start stitching on the extended line, and we're going to go all the way through. So there's our first piece, and really piece 9 is far enough away that we really don't have to worry about pinning this, because there's not a whole lot of fear of getting this caught. As long as you're staying with a 1/4 inch seam, you're even okay down here at this little point. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put on piece 9. Again, we're going to make sure that we're into the seam allowance on this side and well into the seam allowance on this side. We're going to flip it over. We're going to start stitching on the extended line, and we're going to stitch all the way through. And as you can see, nothing was caught, so that's good. We'll continue on with that until we get these all stitched. I'll be back after I get these trimmed, and I'll show you how easy these go together. Now comes the time to put the 4 segments together, and we want to line them up so that piece 7, which is this piece on my block, it's the green part, faces the center like so. So just like we did with block 3, because we extended our stitching lines on our foundation piece, we don't have to be quite as careful putting these together. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these together, right sides together, and we're going to ensure that we're putting the raw edges together on our foundation pieces, and we'll put a pin in there. We'll come over to the other side, and again we're going to make sure that we're putting raw edges together, and we've got our corners even. And we're going to put a pin in there. And now we're ready to stitch. So we're going to take a few stitches. We're going to back up. have to bear with me, folks. I'm having a little sewing machine difficulty again today. And I'm going to stitch down this 1/4" seam allowance, removing the pin before I get to it. Back up. Now when I flip this over, I should be stitched also on the 1/4" line here, which tells me when I fold it out, I'm matching exactly where I need to be on that angle. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to put the other piece together, and I'll come right back to you. Now that we have our 2 sections sewn together, like so, we're going to go ahead and press these seams open so that we can join the entire block together. Again, I like to use the seam stick when I'm pressing these open. So I'm going to place my seam right along that rounded edge of my stick, press the seam open, and then press firmly on that seam line. I'm going to flip it over and press again. And you can see by running that stitching down into the seam line how easily it was for me to match the critical point on this block. Now we're going to go ahead and press this block open. We're going to do the same thing, lay it down on the seam stick. Now if you don't have a seam stick, that's okay. You can just use your pressing surface that you've been using all along. I like it because it really seems to make the seam press flatter, because I'm pressing against wood instead of a padded surface. So that's why I prefer to use it, but you use whatever is at your disposal. I'll flip it over and we're going to press the other way. Now we'll go back to the machine and we're going to piece these 2 sections together to make our star block. Again, we want to make sure that we're putting the piece that you're using for section 7, in my case it's the green. We want to make sure that they're meeting in the center like so. And we're going to do the same thing that we did before, in that we're going to make sure that our foundation pieces are lined up against the raw edge and against the raw edge on the corner. And we're going to place a pin. We're going to go to the opposite side and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make sure that we have our raw edge lined up both here and here, and we're going to place a pin. Now we're going to come to the center seam and we're going to make sure that that is also lined up, and making sure that our edges are even along the line here. We're going to place a pin on this side and we're going to place a pin on this side. Again, we have our edges all even along this edge, at the corners, and now we're ready to stitch. So we're going to stitch in a little bit, take a few stitches, back up, and I like to back all the way off, remove the pin, Now when we get to the seam, right before we get there, always double check to make sure that your seam is indeed laying open on the opposite side. Sometimes as you're sewing and the fabric gets caught between your extension table or whatever it is that you're using, that might cause that seam to flip up for you. So always double check that before you get to it. And then you can use your seam ripper for something other than ripping seams and just use it to hold that seam flat as you stitch it. Remove that pin and let's come down the other side. And let's remove that pin and off the end, back stitch. Now let's see what we've come up with. And now we have our block matched up just as it should be. Let's go over and press this open, and we can call this block done. So we're ready to press this block. Again, I've got my seam stick down. I'm finger pressing the seam open, and then I'm going to press with the iron. And we're going to flip it over. And we're going to press. Now the nice thing about this block as compared to the Bethettes that we've been doing, we only have one section that we have to match, and that's these green pieces. Everything else is far away from the center, so you're really getting some relief on this block compared to others. Congratulations, you've just completed block 4.